Okay? If you didn't like your grade, again, there's an assignment due Friday night at 11:59. I've had a few people turn it in. I sent that out. It doesn't show up. You have to look at your calendar. You know what I mean? And look ahead a few days because it doesn't pop up in that things to do until it gets closer, right? So 29 points definitely help your grade if you did not do well on the test, and will help you with the terms that we're going to be talking about in this chapter. Okay, so in the last lecture, I went through and we just talked about the English heritage, so the English documents or constitutions that impacted our government. Of course, the people that were coming here were from England. Okay, so you have the Magna Carta, limited representative government. So you get the petition of right. They set up Parliament, and eventually Parliament turns to the English Bill of Rights. Okay, and that is where the House of Commons becomes more powerful than the House of Lords. The king loses power, and the power transfers to the people. And this is kind of the journey we're on to the New World. We have Jamestown, Plymouth Rock, and so forth. Eventually, we're going to get 13 colonies. Each system will have limited representative government. And in many cases, especially in these independent colonies, they were basically had self-rule. They got to govern themselves, and they liked it. Okay, so for 150 years, from 1607 to 1760, okay, 1761, this is known as the era of salutary neglect. Basically, because the king and parliament were an ocean away, they couldn't control what was happening in the colonies. You can't micromanage something that is that far away. So they really had to leave it in the hands of the colonists to govern themselves, okay, to some extent, right? So that moves us to this next slide, okay, moving towards independence. So why did people come here? Why did people brave the Atlantic Ocean to come over to the New World? Okay, now these are your colonies. Okay, now this is not Maine. This is part of kind of Massachusetts. Okay, they came for financial reasons. A lot of them were fleeing debt to get out of Europe and get away from having to pay their bills. We know groups like the Puritans came for religious freedom, and then some, and I mentioned this in the lecture yesterday, especially in state or colonies like Georgia, and these were places where they sent criminals to get them out of the jails in England, and they sent them over here to work off their time. And so they were able to, once they did that, hopefully start a new life here in the New World. None of this was easy. Okay. Now, there were attempts to bring the 13 colonies together. Okay. Now, the British don't like that idea. They don't want unity here. Okay. They like the separate colonies. All right. But one of the main reasons why they would want to unify is for defensive purposes against non-English settlers, i.e. the French, and the Native Americans that were here, okay, so that they could have an army to defend themselves. So the New England Confederation, which they tried 1643 to 1684, did not work out. And then later on, in the 1700s, 1754, Ben Franklin proposed this Albany Plan of Union. Okay. Now, the British didn't like this, and some of the colonies did. Okay, so if you were a small colony like South Carolina or Delaware or Rhode Island, you didn't want to be dominated by the big colonies like Virginia and Pennsylvania. Okay, so they didn't like this idea either. They didn't want to be ruled by New York. Okay. So there's going to be some events that are going to trigger this road to independence. Okay. What I'm talking about here is just, these were some attempts to unify the colonies that didn't work out. What will unify the colonies? Well, hatred of British policies is going to unify the colonies. Okay, that's what's going to really right here towards independence from Britain. Okay. Now, I know you guys have studied this probably in like, 5th grade or something like that. And last year in history, you kind of covered this time period. Okay, we're going to do it from a little bit different perspective here. Is the ACT hard? Did you take it? Mm-hmm. Everybody took it? First time? Your brain fried when you were done?
My neck hurt.
Took the SAT like 1985. It didn't go well. Good here? All right. All right, so for 150 years, this is kind of just reinforcing kind of what I've been talking about, okay? So, an ocean apart, there's England, okay? Here's the colonies over here. So 150 years, those assemblies gradually gained powers, governors' powers were weakened. The governors that ran the colonies, even if they were appointed by the king, felt more pressure from the locals because the king couldn't manage that. Okay? And in many cases, these elected assemblies controlled the governor's salaries. So if they controlled the governor's salary, then they had to listen to the people. Okay. Okay. There's King George the Third. Okay. All right. So a little history here. You've got George III is the king. Now remember, by this time, Parliament has a lot of power. Okay, but the king still does have a say. All right. So in 1760, the king and Parliament feel like the colonies are, they're doing their own thing. They think they're all that. They're kind of doing what they want, and we need to kind of clamp down on that. okay? Because we don't want these people getting any ideas, all right? Now, there's a war here called the French and Indian War. Okay? There were actually 4 wars between the British and the French. Okay. Now, one of the major differences between these two countries, right, is that the Brits now are Protestant, French are Catholic. Okay, so we're going to see 4 wars. They're called Queen Anne's War, King George's War, King William's War, and then this is the 4th. Okay, and guys, these are world wars. So the British and French are fighting both in Europe and in the New World, which is expensive. Okay, and so I don't know if you know, you guys remember how this war started? The French War, who we competed for that? It was actually our very own George Washington. I don't know if you remember this story about how George Washington was sent out into the wilderness to do some mapping and stuff like that. And he took some Indians with him, some Native Americans, okay? And one of those Indians was called the Half King. And they're out in the wilderness, and this Native American chief wanted to kind of prove his warriorship, like he was a warrior, okay? And they came across these 3 Frenchmen, and the Half King killed them and scalped them. But what Washington didn't realize, or the Half King, not that he cared, was that those were 3 French diplomats that they had just murdered. Okay? And so some French troops show up and attack Washington's men. And Washington retreats and builds a fort out in the wilderness. It's called Fort Necessity. I don't know if you remember ever learning that, Fort Necessity. Completely surrounded by the French. So they're going to lay siege where they won't allow any food in. So Washington has to surrender. But Washington doesn't speak French. He doesn't read French. He doesn't write French. So the French give him terms of surrender, which basically Washington signs this document admitting to the murder of these 3 French diplomats. And then they have him sign that, and they say, okay, take this back to the British. So Washington goes back to Virginia, gives this letter to the British, and they're like, did you read this before you signed it? Because you just admitted to murder. And that's what set off the French and Indian War, okay? Which lasted how many years? 7 years. In Europe, they call it 7 Years' War. In Canada, they just call it the war, okay? We use French and Indian, which in today's politically correct language is seen as offensive. Well, we're not supposed to say Indians anymore, so Native Americans. So the name itself. Now, in this war, it's the French with some Native American tribes versus the Americans, the colonists, the British, and other Native American tribes. So there were tribes on both sides. You understand? Now, there were more with the French than there were with the Americans. Okay? So you have the British Army, which they sent over 20,000 regulars. You have the colonial militias. So, guys, if you were living in the colonies and you were a male throughout this whole time, I mean, from 1607 forward, every colony had to join the militia if you were a male, except for one. That was Pennsylvania, where the Quakers were. Okay. So, guys, the militia would fight alongside the British. And so George Washington led the Virginia militia and so forth. So he fought alongside the British in the French and Indian War. Okay, so he knew a lot of the big wig generals for the British. Okay. Well, they feel like, because this is so expensive, is it too much to ask the colonists to chip in some to help pay for the war that protected the colony? Is that too much to ask? You know, we should pay for that. Well, apparently the colonists don't think that's right. Why do they not think it's right that they should have to pay taxes? Pay for these soldiers. You guys remember this? No taxation without representation. The colonies, because based on the English Bill of Rights, the only way the king can tax is if Parliament approves it. Okay? But the colonists don't have any representation in Parliament. So you're going to tax them without any say. Well, based on the English Bill of Rights, that's wrong. Okay? The colonists want to be treated like British citizens. They're not. They're being treated like second-class citizens. They don't like that. Okay? So in 1765, Parliament is going to set up several trade restrictions and taxes. Okay? I don't know if you remember learning this term in world history. Mercantilism. Okay? This is where the colonies exist for the mother country. Where the colonies, their job is to provide raw materials to the mother country. Their job is to buy goods from the mother country so the mother country can be more successful. Okay? So they start enforcing that. Trade restrictions that you can only buy what kind of tea? You can only buy British tea. You can't buy tea from somewhere else. Okay? So this is mercantilism. And then, of course, the Stamp Act. So, like, if you wrote a contract, it would have to have a stamp on it. If you printed a newspaper, it had to have a stamp on it. If you printed a pamphlet, it had to have a stamp on it. Okay? And that money would go to the British. All right? And so people turned against this. Okay? They said, this isn't fair. Taxes on non-British goods made imports expensive. That would be like tariffs they put on goods from other places. Okay? And this is going to anger the ordinary colonists and the business owners. Okay? The people that run shops, the ones that sell goods. This is going to make everything more expensive. People don't like this. Okay? So the reaction to this is going to be strong. Okay? Any Van Halen fans in here? Have you heard Van Halen? You've heard of Van Halen? Eddie Van Halen died yesterday. 65 years old. Cancer. Saw him in concert about 12 years ago. Good story. Want to hear a story? Yeah. Okay. So Van Halen has, in the history of record sales in the United States, the 19th highest record album sales in history. Okay, so top 20 bands in American history. Okay, so 1980s, and so they were performing an Intrust about, I think it's about 12 years ago, and me and my buddy Tom and his buddy Ch2 were going to go, and well, Ch2 worked at AT&T store where they sell phones. He sold phones. And one of the roadies for Van Halen came in to get his phone fixed. And he gave him 2 passes to go into like this pit area by the state. And so, but there were 3 of us going to the show, and we only had 2 passes. So we did rock, paper, scissors. And me and Josh won. So Tom had to sit in our seats, and we got in the pit. So I'm standing in the pit, which like there's a runway around. So you're kind of inside the stage. And Eddie Van Halen, their guitarist, is like right there, like 10 feet away the whole night. So that was pretty cool as a Van Halen fan. All right, good here? All right, so this angers the colonists, yes? Business practices unfair. Taxation by British Parliament without colonial representatives. Taxation without representation. Okay, so you're going to see organizations start to pop up like this one, the Sons of Liberty. Okay? Tyranny, it's not tyranny, it's tyranny. Absolute rule by government that ignores the rights and welfare of the people. Okay? So as the Americans start to reject these policies, they start to disrupt the British, to anger the British. Okay? They're standing up for themselves. Now, you know some of the names, right? Sam? Sam who? Sam Houston? No. Huh? He makes beer. He makes beer? Remember that name?
Been a while.
Hancock. Not Herbie Hancock. John Hancock. Okay. Thanks for trying. Paul Revere. Okay. These are some of the early, like, troublemakers. Okay. There will be many, but these are kind of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty. Okay. Especially Sam Adams, and John Hancock. Okay. Now, Sam Adams is the older cousin of John Adams. Okay. And all of these men live in what city? Where's all this crap take place? Boston. Okay. All right. So let's get to it. Let's get some rebellion going here. Okay. Okay. So when they passed the Stamp Act, there's another Adams that I mentioned, John. Okay. Adams, that's going to write the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, okay, to protest the Stamp Act and their policies. You're going to start boycotting British goods. Okay. Now, this Declaration of Rights and Grievances is written by John Adams. historians kind of say this Declaration of Rights and Grievances is kind of a rough draft of a document that would be written 11 years later, the Declaration of Independence, okay? So Adams has an impact because the British are going to repeal the Stamp Act, okay? But they still need money. They're in debt. So other taxes are going to follow. And you guys remember any of the taxes that, the what? Tea tax? Sugar tax, okay? And then they had taxes like the Townshend Acts, which were tariffs on imported goods. The British really started clamping down on this sort of thing, okay? So they needed the money, so they're going to tax, even though the colonists aren't happy about it, okay? So this is 1765, so we're covering 5 years here. Tensions grow in 1770 with the Boston Massacre, okay? Because of groups like the Sons of Liberty, which was first called the Committees of Correspondence, the British decided to occupy Boston, okay? So they start bringing in ships into Boston Harbor. They've got soldiers posted on the street corners. This is like martial law, okay? And on one fateful evening, as British soldiers were standing their post, there was basically a riot. Things at the British soldiers. Snowballs. Yeah, I don't know if you ever go to a coastal area, a lot of times, you know, we use gravel, we have gravel roads and stuff like that when we'll put down in the country, right? Well, in a lot of coastal places where they have oyster shells, and they'll break up oyster shells as to kind of have a street, you know what I mean? So you have all these, and so people were picking up oyster shells and throwing them at British soldiers. And clubs. They did a lot. They had a lot of rope makers in Boston. They would make rope for the ships and so forth. And they used these clubs to beat out the rope. And they were throwing these clubs at the soldiers too. Well, one of them opened fire. And then the others did. Okay. And before you knew it, 5 people were dead. Yeah, I think 9 were shot, but 5 were killed, okay? This was a riot. Okay, so the British soldiers are going to be put on trial for murder. Does anybody know who represents those soldiers as their attorney? John Adams. He's a lawyer in Boston. He's also a farmer. Okay. Now, you've all seen this picture before. The British soldiers shooting at the colonists. This is in like every textbook in America. See this? You know what I'm talking about? I think I have the picture up here. Yeah, there it is. Okay. I just didn't get me this. Bought me this ball back from Boston. Okay. This looks like a massacre, right? This picture looks like a massacre. And that's what they call it, the Boston Massacre. Now, these soldiers were defending themselves. John Adams, they will be found not guilty, these soldiers, by a jury of Bostonians. So people that lived there were fed this propaganda. Now, the person that drew this picture was actually called a lithograph. It was Paul Revere. This was propaganda, okay? And so they're like trying to get the other colonies, other people to really stand up against the British. Okay? So what was the committees of correspondence? They were writing letters, correspondence to the king, to the parliament. Okay? Will eventually turn into the Sons of Liberty. Now, as I said, the radicals here in the Sons of Liberty, John Adams is asked, after he gets the British soldiers off, he's asked to join the Sons of Liberty by his cousin Saint. And he's like, no, I'm not doing it. I am for the law. I think we need to work things out with the British. Okay? Well, that's going to change. So from where John Adams is like, I don't want independence, I just want things to go back to normal. Okay? That's going to change in 1773 and 1774. Okay? So it's a really interesting relationship between Sam Adams and John Hancock. John Hancock is one of the wealthiest people in Boston. Okay? He owns several ships. All right, he inherited this from his uncle. He was orphaned as a child, sent to live with his uncle. His uncle was very wealthy. His uncle died. Hancock inherits this. Okay, so he's a wealthy ship owner. Sam Adams is basically a failed businessman, a tavern owner, and kind of lives in the shadows. He's kind of a shady character. So you got this really rich guy and this shady character. They're like complete opposites. But they will be the driving force behind the Sons of Liberty. Okay? And so they start to stockpile. They start to buy guns. Okay? And gunpowder. Just in case. Okay? The British want to get frisky. So 1773, you've all heard of this, the Boston Tea Party. And here's a picture of Sam Adams. Okay. You can imagine these guys are sitting around at a tavern. It's after midnight. They've been drinking. And they're railing against the British. Everybody's talking smack. And you can imagine these bunch of people, and they're like, hey, let's dress up like Mohawk Indians and go dump this British tea into the harbor. Okay? Because that's what they had to drink. They weren't allowed to bring in tea from other places. And so they were bitter about it. And so over 300 caskets of tea are thrown into the harbor. Okay? And so what the British response to this is, we call them the Intolerable Acts. And this is 1774, okay? Once the king and parliament find out about this tea party, they're like, the heck with that. Now, they call it the Coercive Acts. Does that see? Let's see what that looks like. I think it's a mess. Coercive acts. Okay? To coerce us into behavior. And we're like, no, this is going to bring the colonists closer together. And these intolerable acts are very strict. Okay? So, like, they're going to shut down Boston Harbor. So, all the commerce that used to come through that harbor, which is a major port, they're shutting it down. You can't use it anymore. They're punishing it. Then they start bringing in more British troops, and they occupy the city of Boston. All right. Okay, hang on. I got to tell you some more stuff here. One of the things that we covered here yesterday is this right here. The Petition of Right, 1628, said no quartering of soldiers, no putting soldiers in people's homes. Okay? So when the British start bringing more and more soldiers to Boston, they can't all sleep on the ships. They got to be in the city. So they start basically kicking in people's doors and forcing them to leave their homes so that British soldiers can stay in. This violates their rights. Okay? Their economic livelihood is being threatened. Now they're being kicked out of their own homes. And so people are very upset. Okay? And so we're going to start to see rebellion. Okay? So immediately after the intolerable acts were created, they set up the first Congress. Okay? Now all assemblies have been outlawed. They're not allowed to have assemblies. Okay? But they're going to do it anyway. So 12 of the 13 colonies are going to send representatives, delegates, representatives to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Okay? A delegate, someone who officially represents. Okay? Now, in this first Continental Congress, representing Massachusetts will be John Adams, Sam Adams, and John Hancock. Okay? And another guy, Elbert Gary, that you don't need to know, but not much gets done here. Okay? They do send King George III the Declaration of Resolves. The colonists got together and said, let's boycott British goods until the policies are changed. And they say, okay, we'll do this again next May if necessary. Okay. So the British did not respond well to the king or to the colony's Declaration of Resolves. Okay. And so they react with even tighter controls on the colonies. And when the British find out that Sam Adams and John Hancock have been stockpiling weapons and powder outside of Boston in a place called Lexington and Concord, British are going to send troops to seize that gun, those guns and that powder, and 2 men to arrest them for treason. That's what they're headed out there to do. Find these 2 guys and take their guns. Thomas Gage, the British general, leads troops out. And while they're on the way out to Lexington and Concord, they are met on the road by who? The Minutemen or the militia. Okay? Now, guys, over 150 years, Americans, colonists, have been fighting against Native Americans. Now, the British are the best trained, best armed army in the world. They wear red coats, which is very easy to see, isn't it? Makes it an easy target. They like to call, the colonists used to call them lobster backs. These British redcoats, lobster backs, right? The colonists are not going to line up in a field and fight the British. They're going to hide behind trees. They're going to fight guerrilla warfare, which they learned from who? From the Native Americans, right? They've learned how to fight. The British, guys, they use what's called linear tactics. They march in columns. They make a lot of noise when they're marching in columns. Okay, there's a lot of clickety clank and stuff. Your army's coming down the road. Okay, they're very easy targets. But guys, the honorable way to fight is with the linear tactics. You line up in an open field. Here's the Brits. Colonists are supposed to line up on the field, and then they shoot at each other. It's crazy. But that's the honorable way to fight. And you really only fight during good weather. You don't fight when it's raining, because then your powder gets wet, or when it's cold, it's too cold. We're not fighting. These are fair weather fighters. So when the winter sets in during the American Revolution, most of the time there's not much fighting. Okay, and if it is being done, we are initiating it. The Americans are. Because we're tough. Okay? It's a hell of a lot colder in the colonies than it is in Britain. Now, I know Britain is up north, but they have the sea currents that bring in warm air to the British Isles. Okay? New England is a heck of a lot worse weather than Britain. Now, they get more rain over there, but, okay. So, guys, these are doctors. These are lawyers. These patriots. These Minutemen. These are shop owners. These are teenagers. 13, 14, farmers. Everybody's got a gun. You had to be in the militia. Everybody had to be in a militia, except for Pennsylvania, right? So these men knew how to shoot. These boys knew how to shoot. Okay? So after, and this is the shot heard around the world, Lexington and Concord, the start of the American Revolution, April 19, 1775, Patriots Day. Okay? I think I might have told you guys this. Patriot Day is 9/11. Patriots Day is April 19th. So then less than a month later, the Second Continental Congress will meet in Philadelphia again, okay, in what's known as Carpenter's Hall. They don't call it Independence Hall yet. Look at how long they're going to meet. This will stay in session from May 10th, 1775 to March 1st, 1781. This is the government of the United States here. Now, they won't declare independence till 1776, July, okay? But this is basically the only thing holding the 13 colonies together, is this Second Continental Congress. They discuss a plan of action versus the British. The road to independence was laid. Now, guys, after Lexington and Concord and the Intolerable Acts, John Adams, not his cousin, John Adams, will become the driving force for independence. There are many colonies here that don't want to declare independence when this meeting starts. They don't want to leave the British. They want to reconcile with the British. So these Boston men, these Massachusetts men, have to try and convince the others that independence is the right way to go. That will not be easy. And it takes somebody that's very stubborn, somebody that's very smart and convincing, like John Adams. John Adams always thought that nobody would remember him. Everybody remembered George Washington. Nobody remembered John. He was always second. Okay? Now, David McCullough, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning author, wrote a book on John Adams about 15 years ago. HBO made it into a miniseries, okay? And it's fabulous. I wish I had time to show you some of it, but I think it is on Amazon Prime. It's called John Adams, okay? And it takes you through all of this stuff, all the way through his presidency, okay? So the road to independence is laid, all right? Let's see what's up here next, just checking. Yeah, we'll get to independence, okay? That's what I will pick up with tomorrow, okay? So you don't want to miss that. So you need to watch the video. Thank you very much.